Welcome to the Marshall Pruett podcast in our week in IndyCar. Derek Daly, thank you for coming on as my guest here as we talk about a crazy month of May with this podcast presented by Cooper Tires, also supported for May by our friends at Bell Racing Helmets USA. Man, we got a lot to unpack, my friend, and then we have a ton of great listener questions. Let's open up with a very basic. Derek Daly, what did you think of this Indy 500 from an entertainment standpoint and from a competition standpoint? Because those are two big topics fans have been chopping up since Sunday.
It was a bust on both accounts. It wasn't competitive nor entertaining.
And thanks for listening to the Week in IndyCar and the Marshall Pruett podcast.
Now, come on. These podcasts are direct. We're not going to sit here and play pleasantries, right?
I'm just mad because you stole exactly what I was going to say, you bastard. But
okay, good. Yeah, because let's face it, there were very few competitive cars, maybe 3 or 4. I saw a piece of video yesterday. Alex Rossi's brilliant passes. Just watch what he's doing. And he's slicing through cars. But he's slicing through junk cars. He's emphasizing how bad most of the cars were at the Indy 500. Hence, it wasn't that competitive. And it wasn't that entertaining because although I did say prior to the race starting, I said unpredictable might be the word. We're not sure what will happen. It actually became very predictable because we could see the cars were not in a position to race. This car does not race well. IndyCar has a major problem on their hands to create a super speedway racing car.
And we're referring to super speedway because, well, let me rephrase that. Super speedway and on the 1 mile oval. Those have been the only 2 races for me, Derek, where the Universal Aero Kit has not specification-wise shined. As I mentioned in our Day at Indy podcast Sunday night after the race, this was really the first major event of the year where I missed the former body package because of the lack of available passing or ready passing for the majority of the field. So this, I'm not keen on just starting off most of our podcasts by hammering things that were wrong, but I think it would be false to paint what happened on Sunday as something that was highly exciting for the most part outside of the restarts. So whether they were junk, the handling capabilities of those cars that Rossi was passing and Oriol Servia was passing, whether they were junk or not, that did lend excitement during those restarts. But outside of those restarts, I struggled to find a lot of instances where you said, wow, that's amazing.
Sure.
I think we're kind of coming to the same point, just in different ways.
Yeah. And to give it an exclamation point, Castroneves, Danica, Canan, and Bourdais had accidents you've never seen them have before. When have you ever seen Castroneves lose control at the apex of a corner at a speedway? Never. It just doesn't happen because he has great feel and he's usually in great cars that are predictable. I don't know whether I've seen a super speedway accident like Bourdais, where he loses it at the most unusual place, tank slaps it, loses it again, and eventually loses it and hits the wall. And so, this all shows how unpredictable the handling of these cars were. A lot of drivers went into safety mode. Hang on here. Don't take chances. Hang on, and let's get through this. And then there was a lower level again where Jay Howard lived and Davison lived when the cars were a nightmare. And they tried to protect themselves and still couldn't stay away from an accident. So, yeah, there's a big issue here. There is a big issue.
So I don't want to sound like a broken record, Derek, because I mentioned this repeatedly throughout the month, mostly, I think, in our Day at Indy podcasts, but also in print, that there are some interesting things for teams to try and overcome technically, which would then ultimately play out kind of as expected in qualifying and in the race. So we had IndyCar mandating rear wing angles. This is the most you can trim it out, and this is the most amount of downforce you can wind in. They left the front wings open, right? But there's also a practical limit there. You can't go nuts on the front wing angle, either positive or negative, but in this case positive, because you are limited on what you can do at the rear. So there's a practical amount of wing angle you'd add to the front, knowing that you can only balance so much at the rear. We did not have many areas of tuning, maybe almost no other areas of tuning in race trim in particular, right? You couldn't add wickers outside of the front wing. You had teams that were painted into a very narrow aerodynamic box. I think that's the first thing that IndyCar will look back on and say, maybe wasn't the right direction, and B, maybe we need to open up more tuning options for next year so that if teams do say we need more rear downforce, we need more whatever, they have some options. Let's also add, Derek, that I think part of the mindset behind the very restrictive aero rules was not wanting to create pack racing where the cars were too gripped up, too much downforce, and nobody could get away from each other. Funnily enough, we almost had the opposite problem where, folks could run and train, but rarely did we see them on top of each other than those restarts. Once we got a couple laps in, outright passing by one competitive car on another competitive car, a little bit of a rarity. So just some, mindset places to consider here. I know they didn't want a big pack race, but at the same time you look at the amount of passing we had last year, and then you compare it to the struggles that folks had this year. Then you throw in the crazy crashes that you mentioned, where you go, this wasn't the lesser talented among us. This wasn't a bunch of rookies who couldn't hold on to their rockets, Derek. It was veteran upon veteran having this weird lack of rear downforce, lack of something getting into the wall. So, to your exact point, a very odd and strange outcome for a lot of the folks that we thought would be in for the win.
Yeah, so let's see what IndyCar does. Now remember, we don't have all the answers, do we? IndyCar has, they do a good job trying to control budgets and trying to keep racing competitive. But I don't think anybody really was able to foresee an Indy type of situation. We all thought, reduce the above surface downforce generated from the underfloor. That'll allow you to run closer together, and we'll have great racing. Well, that's apparently what they did, and it didn't work. So there's a missing ingredient here aerodynamically, because it's not mechanical. Because remember, the car is mechanically exactly as it was last year, but there's a missing aerodynamic ingredient here, and some teams may have worked it out. May have. Now they didn't work it out on all the cars, because it was really only Rossi in the Andretti car that looked as if he felt good. Yeah. Graham Rahal told me at the banquet, he said, my car was on rails. I looked at him and says, Graham, you've got a great team. You've got enough budget. You have engineers from across the globe with experience in everything. Tell me how you were last and second last for the first 2 days, fastest on day 3, and last again on day 4. That tells me you don't know what you're doing. That you're lost. And said, how were you on rails? Were you on rails by accident? Do you know why you were on rails? Can you reproduce that again? I'm not sure they can, because it was so topsy-turvy all through the practice days. And, was the Penske on rails? I'm not sure it was. I think they worked hard during the race and got the car good. I still think Ed Carpenter had the fastest car in the race. I do think Ed Carpenter had the best car. He just got beaten in the pit lane. As soon as Penske recognized we have to get track position on Carpenter, they short-filled him. They did whatever they needed to do boom, just to jump him. And now they had complete control because they knew Ed Carpenter couldn't get close to him because the cars weren't competitive enough amongst themselves for Carpenter to get close to Will Power. And that basically meant Power was going to win the race.
And the point you raised there as well is a perfect one, Derek, in that in the conversation I had and Robin Miller and I had with Helio Castroneves coming out of qualifying weekend, I believe it was Monday, even then he was saying, we're throwing everything at it, and we still don't fully understand it. Obviously, I can tell you that from just my own experience in covering the Indy 500, forget, days working on the team side, just covering it, I've never seen the collective pit lane more confused than they were this year. Doesn't matter, big team, small team, Chevy, Honda, doesn't matter. More teams were confused about what they needed to produce a quality race car, something that could go 500 miles and be stable and consistent. I've never seen anything like it. Would definitely, again, trace this back to if you have so few options on how to tune the car aerodynamically to make it something that can be consistent and stable. That's why we see Helio, Tony, Danica, this, that, so many folks just caught out by surprise when normally we wouldn't. Let me throw in here quickly, Derek, that this May, which is almost over, thankfully, our friends at Bell Racing USA have supported the Marshall Pruett podcast throughout the month. Their helmets have been the choice of champion since 1954. We're talking about state-of-the-art head protection. I know that there are a couple of Daly family members who also rely on Bell, so no coincidence there. Designed for professional and amateur drivers, Bell is synonymous with safety, innovation, performance, and engineering excellence. And you can learn more about Bell helmets by visiting bellracing.com. So, Derek,
and I was a Bell helmet user in Formula One myself.
Yes, but I'm trying to get people to want to buy them, not run to other products. So I don't know why you threw that in there.
Love the Bell helmet, guys.
So, as we mentioned at the outset here, we have a lot to cover, and we're going to do our best to get through. Yeah. Now, granted, this might not all be completely linear, because if you figured out one thing so far, my brain isn't always a linear thing. So we got some news about this 500 race just within the last 24 to 48 hours, Derek, that the ABC ratings downturn yet again. I know that there are some good folks who try very hard to make IndyCar on ABC and ESPN a positive thing. I can tell you that on a personal level, the fact that my hero, the hero of Mario Andretti, one of the only drivers you will ever hear A.J. Foyt openly gush about and rave about, the great thinker and driver Dan Gurney with his death in January, IMSA was quick, Fox was quick to put together a tribute for Dan going into the Rolex 24. We went into St. Petersburg, which was the first IndyCar race of the year on ABC. Zero mention whatsoever. I mentioned to some IndyCar brass that, hey, I know you don't make the ABC broadcast, but you might mention to them that they really dropped the ball here. And but hey, you have the Indy 500, the crown jewel, as a perfect place to fix that. Definitely a place where Dan's innovation was known. And unless I missed it on my ABC broadcast, yet again, no mention of the Big Eagles passing, which I thought was just classless. But I also, frankly, thought it was fitting for an entity that seems to have paid more attention to celebrating their own history at IMS than actually thinking about one of the biggest contributors to it in modern years. So, not too upset that it's going away. Not too surprised that the ratings were down, even with the inclusion of Danica Patrick and Helio Castroneves returning. Were you surprised?
It's been a downward trend, Marshall, for years. I mean, we'd kid ourselves if we thought this sport was growing on television. And if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. there has to be a different, better way to attract a new audience that we haven't got right now. The hope is, with a change of national broadcasters, that NBC will grasp this and make it their personal mission. We are going to grow this sport. Liberty, right at the moment, is on a mission to grow Formula One. Now, Formula One is big to start with, but they're going to grow it. They are after a different market, a market that isn't attached to racing right now. Hopefully, NBC will commit to doing the same thing. We're going to grow the sport. And you only grow the sport with human drama stories. I don't care what car you have. There's no spec car series that is attractive to a television viewer. It is driven by human drama stories. The likes of Danica. I hope another Danica appears somewhere. I hope we have national pride stories like a Newgarden domination of something, like a Rahal coming good finally, like a Spencer Pigot, like a young American brash Sage Karam type guy. You watch me, what I'm doing. We need those guys and need not to be afraid of them being part of our sport. People got afraid of Sage Karam, and I think it was hugely detrimental to the sport.
Completely agree. Well, let's bounce back to passing for a moment. And I think we do need to spend a little bit more time not just praising, but discussing the either bravado or willingness for an Alexander Rossi, an Oriol Servia, and very few folks did this, but some of those who said, I'm going to flirt with the high line because I have a good car and I can go around others. Part of me wonders why some of the faster cars towards the front of the pack weren't employing a similar strategy. And I'm curious from your own experience, Derek, if you can share what it's like being inside the cockpit and thinking, I haven't maybe seen a lot of folks using the high line, rubbering it up, adding grip to it, but should I venture high and see if I either get lucky or find the wall?
Well, I know where you're coming from with this. I don't believe they suddenly got super brave, Rossi or Servia. Their cars were able to run there, and it was exaggerated how brave they looked because the cars they were passing were horrible. I never saw Rossi pass Power or pass Ed Carpenter or pass any really quick cars. So I think we had a race of vastly different performing cars, and it looked more impressive than it actually was, because his car just happened to be good. It just happened to be good.
Well, that might be the case, but those cars didn't drive themselves. And if you look at some of the passes that were pulled off, there were some extremely brave moments where calamity could have been the outcome. So whether that's foolishness or bravery, I guess that's up for debate. But the cars weren't steering themselves. Those decisions weren't being made by the Dalardi W12s they were occupying. There was some supreme either belief in the car or the grip would be found and they would survive in order to pull off those passes. So no question that their cars were incredibly good, but they weren't the only ones with good cars in the field, yet seemed to distinguish themselves by venturing high and capitalizing on those who maybe weren't enjoying that same amount of performance from their rides. Well, let's look through, Derek, some of the other performers in the race. Robert Wiccans, Rookie of the Year, finished 9th. I thought he had a somewhat classic Robert Wiccans race in that, unlike maybe some of the previous events this year where he looked like he could have won, never seemed to be in that mode. And again, I don't think Honda was really in a position to move any of their drivers into winning contention, but knowing that they did not have a stellar qualifying, Wiccans qualifying 18th, the fact that he moved forward to 9th, learned a lot, seemed to drive in his usual intelligent manner, is also now up to 7th in the standings. I thought this just seemed like a great race that, if anything, is going to pay off next year when he returns, since really victory and drinking the milk didn't seem to be on the cards. What came to mind with his performance for you?
Good, very solid. I'm not sure people understand where he came from, but Robert Wiccans spent 8 years in the Mercedes development program in Europe, DTM, race winner, fast. But before that, he was Daniel Ricciardo's teammate in Renault 3.5, which is a racing car that's faster than an Indy car. Quite frankly, it is. A 3.5 is faster than an Indy car. He spent a year as teammate to Daniel Ricciardo. Now, Daniel Ricciardo today is considered one of the top 2 or 3 best drivers in the world, and his stock continues to rise. Wiccans took on Daniel Ricciardo head-to-head every race, every weekend, all through the season, and beat him. But Ricciardo was in the Red Bull system and went on to Formula One, and Wiccans went to Mercedes DTM. This guy is very good, very talented. He didn't get good when he got here. He was good. He's always been good. Now he has the opportunity and the stability of Schmidt-Peterson, which every driver desperately needs. They need stability. And Wiccans has that, and he's going to continue to show every weekend that he's very, very good. And he's relaxed knowing that he has a full season ride.
Wiccans has been the topic of another point of interest, Derek. After St. Pete, I think either in a podcast or something I wrote, just mentioned that looking at how he performed at St. Pete, looking at the class he demonstrated while dealing with a very unsavory result, having come so close to victory, and just how his very clean, buttoned-up nature seemed to be everything a Roger Penske would want in the future. At least then mentioned, I would not be surprised if RP comes knocking on his door. Welcome to the Marshall Pruett podcast. I've been hearing more and more throughout race week that one Robert Wiccans is indeed on Roger Penske's wish list. Rumors of Wiki possibly being courted by Penske, inquiries to Sam Schmidt. All these things have made the rounds. Not vouching for their accuracy, but I will vouch for the fact that if there is one driver, actually not just one driver, 2 drivers in the paddock, both Rossi and Wiccans that seem to fit Roger's Penske perfect mold, they would be it. And with questions over Power's ongoing presence in the team prior to the 500, and also the belief that his contract is up at the end of the year, wouldn't surprise me if there had been at least some sort of reaching out from the Penske organization to see who might be available. I think Will has probably guaranteed himself a contract with his Indy 500 win, but do you think, Derek, there could be any real fire going on behind the smoke here about either a Wiccans to Penske, a Rossi to Penske, and where would they fit in?
Could be. I mean, they are 2 Penske perfect type of drivers, without a doubt. Temperament fits Penske, but I don't know. I did not hear that rumor myself. I did not hear that. If you look at Power has had a confidence struggle in the last, well, certainly since Newgarden went there, and maybe a little bit before that. And drivers need confidence to truly unlock all of their talent. And I think this win at the 500. Don't be surprised if the momentum now with Power begins to take over. Because, remember, for years he was considered the fastest driver in IndyCar. It just didn't quite all click for him at the right time. But it's a bit like Nigel Mansell in Formula One. He couldn't win. Then when he won the big one, bang, Mansell took off and became unbeatable, when he was in the right car and the right package. Well, Will Power has the right car and the right package. So I'm not sure there's going to be room at Penske in the next couple of years, but courting drivers is what he does. Joseph Newgarden had his interview more than a year before he signed with Penske. So, they like to keep an eye on drivers and have a chat and bring them into the family. And so we'll wait and see. You never know.
Let's look through a couple of other drivers that stood out. Scott Dixon might have had the quietest run to third place that I can remember at Indianapolis. I mean, improved from ninth. So ninth to third, certainly good. Top Honda runner on a day in a month, Derek, where Chevy just owned everything. You had Hunter-Reay in fifth, moving up from 14th. Again, another kind of forward progress race for him. Pagenaud struck me as a little bit funny. Finished sixth, started second. Really didn't seem to be part of the winning conversation for most of the race. I mean, I know he was there or thereabouts, but just didn't seem to have that strength. And there was Carlos Munoz as well. Started 21st, finished 7th. Carlos is another guy. First race, only race of the year with Andretti. And yet again, he does a similar Munozian type thing of getting somewhat towards the front. What comes to mind among Dixon, Hunter-Reay, Pagenaud, Munoz? I mean, these guys were the B players behind the Will Power and Ed Carpenter show, but do you think they showed us anything truly memorable on Sunday, or were they just, runner-ups?
No, yeah, I think they had blue-collar days, I call them. Workhorse days, blue-collar, don't take too many chances, take advantage of yellows, do a good job in the pit, and bring it home as best you can. Rahal, I thought, had a great run.
Oh, yeah.
To get himself to P10 also. Again, workman, I don't think any of those guys were ever going to win. Well, unless Power and Carpenter dropped out. None of those guys who mentioned were true, legitimate contenders. I mean, I never really heard Joseph Newgarden's name almost the whole day.
I was going to mention that the Penske decided to split strategies, and Newgarden was able to claw his way back up to 8th. That struck me as a little bit strange, Derek, knowing that Joseph came in leading the points in the championship. Maybe, part of me wonders if Penske said, all right, well, yeah, even if this gamble doesn't work and going off strategy with Joseph, it can't ding his points haul too much. But on the flip side, part of me says, well, why would you take the reigning champion who's leading the points and use him as your gamble? That one struck me as weird.
But was that the gamble, Marshall? I mean, did they pull him off strategy early?
It wasn't that early. And I'd have to look back and see the exact lap, but I just seem to recall.
Because very often Penske will pull you off strategy if they're convinced you can't win. And Will Power slowly positioned himself. And, did they make the decision because they realized he's not going to win the way he's running now, so we might as well try off strategy. I don't know if that's what happened, but that's usually the determining factor of a Penske type of decision.
Jared Hildebrand was another driver, Derek, that had a quiet month, right? Other than getting into the wall a little bit in practice, but started 27th, which isn't a very Hildebrand thing at Indianapolis, obviously with a smaller Brian Reinbold team making their season debut. Again, I would say a workman-like day for him, but if I'm looking at those in the top half of the finishing order, his run from 27th to 11th, I don't know if that got him as much attention as it deserves, because considering the team, considering the relative lack of speed they'd shown throughout the month, obviously he did something fairly impressive there to come home 11th.
Yes. Yeah, and I think, Marshall, because the race wasn't what I would call a competitive race, anybody outside the top 10 no matter how good a job you did, if it was an outstanding job, you won't really get credibility for it, or get any credence for doing a good job, because the race wasn't regarded as a good race anyway. So, Marco, Chavez, Wilson, they're all sort of thereabouts, off strategy, big risks, got a bit of TV time, Wilson and Harvey, but short-lived. But I think because the race was a bit of a dud, anybody from 10th down is just sort of, you were there and that was it.
I can't really argue with that too much. Another driver that stood out to me looking at the remaining ones that I found impressive, and actually this kid impressed me throughout the month, Zachary Clayman DeMello.
Okay, and I was going to say Leist. We should come back to Leist also.
Well, let's hit both here. We had Mateus, quick Chevy.
Yeah.
Top performer for Foyt. Also a surprise.
Yeah. And I met him for the first time, and he is delightful. I mean, a giggly, fresh face, doesn't even look 19. I was surprised that he kept his nose clean for as long as he did. Now, in fairness, Foyt gave Canan and Leist two of the best cars. They were the fastest in the test. He was fastest on carb day. So they genuinely had two of the best cars in the race. So that always helped. And then Clayman DeMello. I mean, DeMello is a young, brash, tattooed Canadian, a bit unusual in our sport, a bit of a, trash talker. I love it. I love that we have somebody like that who doesn't care what people think. He is an old school racer. Let's have some fun. And I just, for him to come in a year like this, where the cars are so unstable, I thought that was a really difficult thing for him to have to do. But two of the coin cars, and they'll readily admit this, two of the coin cars, him being one of them, the two primary cars, they were able to keep a good handling package under them and reasonable control of them, and that helped DeMello. But overall, I think, Marshall, you're absolutely right. He did a good job.
Leist,
and a brash, young, tattooed kid like that is good for the sport.
I think Leist was honestly one of the biggest surprises of the race.
Yeah,
not because, not 13th in and of itself as a finishing position, not memorable. But that kid has either been a million miles an hour impressive, or what were you thinking in the wall? And given 500 miles, 200 laps, I think there was a genuine fear among those who followed Mateus that, he's going to be out early, he's going to do something dumb. The fact that he didn't, the fact that he was very competitive, running with, in or around Canan for, as long as Tony was in the race, the fact that he was able to do 200 smart laps. This, I think, just shows his growth. That, I would say, is another big triumph for him. Forget where he finished in the race. The fact that this kid was on the lead lap, did nothing dumb, and proved that maybe some of the rookie jitters, or whatever you might want to call it, have settled down. That, I thought, was really impressive. With Clayman DeMello, I appreciated the fact that, unlike Mateus and others who came into the first day of practice with some experience around the track, having done the test day or otherwise, this kid who basically found out a matter of days beforehand he was going to be in the Indy 500, instead of being a ball and nerves or otherwise, just handled his business, qualified 13th, fell back to 19th in the race. So again, I'm not making any proclamations that we have the next IndyCar champion here. Way too early to make any prognostications there, but the kid seemingly could have finished last and no one would have been surprised. The fact that he held his own for the most part, I think that was smart. Piggott, I'll tell you, Spencer Piggott is one driver, Derek, who, without that speeding penalty on pit lane, makes me wonder how his day would have gone. Because up till that point, and that penalty did come fairly early, Spencer was looking like he could have been a top 6 contender, top 8 contender.
Yeah.
So,
he could have been.
And we've got some questions here about your son Connor that I'll try and save most of them for the Q&A part. But not just mentioning this because you're the guest, but we would be charitable in saying Connor did not have a very fast chariot all month. He obviously benefited from a fair amount of people finding the wall. But if there was one driver who could have easily crashed and everyone would have said, yeah. That seems like that would be fitting for the kind of month he's been having. But he didn't. Came home 21st. I mean, that I thought was talk about a blue-collar day. It showed a lot of resolve there, too.
Yeah. And his car was a dog down the straight. For the first 5-lap run he did in the month of May, his car was the slowest car down the straight. And 7 days, 8 days, 10 days later after practice qualifying, it was still the same, 3 miles an hour slower than Bourdais' car. So, it was unbelievably frustrating for him to put the work together to have the U.S. Air Force there and not be able to get anything done about it. So he knew he was in hang-on mode. He got absolutely killed by 2 yellows. He was in the pit lane finishing his pit stop when both yellows came out. And that's how he lost his lap. But, 15th, 16th is the highest he could have been. But if you look at the speed of his car, that's about where he should have finished. He was about the, with the people that crashed and the speed his car could do, that's about where he should have finished. So, yeah, another blue-collar day, but at least it was 500 miles of experience for him and, move on from there. You can't buy experience. It's just great to have those miles.
Tell you one driver that did surprise me in a indifferent way was Max Chilton. So if we look at last year and the fact that while driving, while having a Chip Ganassi Honda, we know that the Hondas were pretty quick last year. Max, I think, definitely demonstrated something at Indy. Whether his ability to lead was part of, getting him up there through strategy or not. I know coming out of 2017, the one race where I remember Max Chilton doing something, seriously, was Indy. Not saying that I expected him to do similar, running top 3, leading the race in Carlin's first ever Indy 500, but I was surprised that as someone who qualified 20th, finished 22nd, couple laps down, to go from, whoa, hey, welcome to the world, Max Chilton. Look at this guy in 2017. I physically saw him competing, but I don't remember anything about his day. So very, to me, Jekyll and Hyde, 2017 to 2018 for him at Indy.
Yeah, but in fairness, Marshall, you got to add in the new car, the new team factor. I don't know how many guys on that team had true Indy 500 experience. How to call pit stops, how to manage the fuel, how to adjust the car, what to do. So I hear what you're saying, but I think you have to give him and Kimball a bit of a pass because of the newness of the team. I mean, we know they can both drive. It's all down to the car. It's all down to the car and the positioning on the racetrack. But I get what you mean.
Well,
but
how's this?
Maybe more of a pass.
There's a kid named Daly who I just heard had a dog of a car and got boned on both yellows and finished ahead of a guy with the highly prized Chevrolet. So you are a far more charitable man than expected. So fair enough. There's little discoveries here. All right. Well, let's get to a couple of other topics here, my friend, before we dive into Q&A. One of the questions that has come from more people than I thought, asking why did Stefan Wilson and Jack Harvey pit, right? They're in the lead, 1, 2, 3 laps to go in the Indy 500. Go for glory, right? Just roll the dice. Well, there's a reality here.
They weren't going to go for glory. They were going to go for embarrassment.
Exactly.
They were out of fuel. The glory was the 2 laps that they led. They took the risk. They should have stopped for fuel, on that last yellow. But the glory was the 2 laps in the lead on national television. And it was only embarrassment after that if they didn't stop.
And the other point here being that unlike the days of old, even when I was doing similar things, looking, doing fuel strategy, it was a little bit of a fudge factor, right? We could be off a little bit. Maybe we could make it. Those factors no longer exist.
Yeah.
The teams know down to the last drop how much they have, how long you can go. And what we're talking about here, 7.5 miles of a gamble. And, they might have gotten a few extra corners, but they were not going to get 7.5 miles out of, we misjudged. So they had to. Yeah. And keep in mind
what they were hoping for was another first lap crash on that restart.
Yep, they needed a few laps of yellow to stretch.
Yeah. That would have potentially finished the race under yellow. The race would have run out.
And they finished.
That was a huge gamble.
15th and 16th, Derek. Had they decided to keep going, I mean, they probably would have been down around 23rd, 24th with how many laps they would have lost. Granted, they weren't exactly giving up a ton of prize money had they done that, but still. If you're trying to retain sponsors and make them happy, you'd rather say we led a few laps and then had to pit for fuel than, look, there we are stalled, an embarrassment to close out the Indy 500. That isn't the type of publicity that any sponsor will tell you that they actually want. Let's see a few other things here. So the Danica Patrick effect. I have to admit, there was a lot of interest, obviously, coming into the month, right? The open test, her first time in an IndyCar in 7 years, or whatever it was. And I know that there were plenty of stories written and coverage provided. If we look at the TV ratings, it's fairly clear that there was no major effect on a national level to get tons of people tuning in, I should say. What about on a local level, Derek? I mean, you live there. I mean, I was there too, but you're going to hear more from locals you're used to. Was there a genuine buzz that she was in the race and taking part, or do you think it became a subplot pretty quickly?
I think it became a subplot fairly quickly. However, she is still a magnet. She is still a human drama story. So there was interest. I'm just so sorry that she went out so quickly, so early in the race.
We had another thing, too, which, according to our friend Robin Miller, has never happened in the 50 years that he has covered the Indy 500. And that was in the middle of the race, after Danica had crashed. Indianapolis Motor Speedway decided to hold a press conference with Danica. And looking at a little bit of... I tweeted that out, and I don't know the Twitter characters, maybe I could have explained things a little more in depth, but there are some folks who, said, well, don't blame Danica. This, she isn't the one choosing to hold a press conference. And I can't really argue with that, Derek, because I can tell you by her demeanor and even by her words, she didn't want to be there. I think that there was some fairly strong urging from someone saying you need to go do this, and she did. But, for those who are always destined to dislike her, I would say that there was nothing really positive to come out of it for her, right? She wasn't going to sell any extra GoDaddy domain registrations from it. It wasn't something where she was getting extra spotlight. If anything, she just wanted to kind of shrink and go away. And so it was just weird. I mean, you're in the middle of a race, and you bring up Danica Patrick. Why not Tony Kanaan? Why not Ed Jones? I mean, we know the answer. I'm not dumb. I'm just saying it's one of those things where you go, isn't there a motor race happening right now? It was a funky one. It was a funky one, brother.
Yeah, I didn't even know that happened. I did not know that happened until this very moment. Yeah,
they tried to bring you up,
right.
but you asked for too much money. I mean, they couldn't meet your demands. So, all right. Well, I was too busy. Let's breeze through a couple of other things. Here's something that I'm not making any claims that this is accurate. I'm just saying that I think we might have something that was pretty cool happening. You look at Will Power, who won the race. You look at his over-the-wall pit crew, the direct crew members that provided those pit stops that were super fast and definitely, I think, provided a little bit of an edge. And it was really cool, for me at least, to see that Quentin Washington, former college football standout at the University of Michigan, who was Will's refueler, was part of that team. Quentin might, not saying is, but might be the first African-American Indy 500 winning crew member. And, especially in a week, actually the night before, at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, where the Willie T. Ribbs documentary Uppity was premiered. Just thought it was cool to see that again. Whether Quentin was the first or not, we certainly know he would be among, one or two. And speaking with Donald Davidson, we couldn't really think of any other Indy 500 winning African-American crew members. Well, obviously there have been, a number of crew members, but not 500 winning. If that is the case, to me at least, just another cool thing where, among the faces, the backgrounds, the histories, the really, truly multifaceted, multi-ethnic composition of what sports have become today. If Quentin was the first, I know that, he's just there doing his job. He's the sweetest, most humblest of people you'll meet. But provided that is the case, or even if he's just added to the legacy, that it wasn't lost on me after the race, seeing him lift up Will Power like he weighed about 5 pounds, hoisted him up in victory lane. I think Will was even surprised, and it was cute seeing some other people kind of reach up to try and help, and you realize Quentin could snap all of us in half. He's used to tackling 300-pound people with ease. Some little Australian guys, not exactly taxing him, but anyways, just cool for me to see that.
Good.
The Unser roast, the Bobby Unser roast, the secret Bobby Unser roast that Robin Miller and Steve Shunk put on leading into race weekend. Luckily, my film partner and I, Travis Long, we filmed that, and that is on our list to put together. It's about 2 hours of footage. We're going to have to, we might cut that into 2 pieces, but boy, it was beautiful. Roger Penske was on the panel of folks roasting Uncle Bobby, Derek, and cursed. So I went over to RP afterwards and said, we need to start the negotiations. I'm just blackmailing you outright. We need to start at about $15,000 for me to edit out the curse words here, and had a good little laugh. So that was another great memory from the event. What other things stood out to you, Derek? And it doesn't necessarily have to be race day, but things from the event that you'll remember, because we're closing the books on this, and this is part of the history.
I think, Marshall, I was surprised that Chevrolet were so dominant over Honda. I think it took everybody by surprise. I mean, I know Honda has been good for the last couple of years, but there was sort of no rumblings. I didn't really hear anything. Oh, Chevrolet have done a great job, and they've changed the maps, and they got more power, and they got party mode like Mercedes in Formula One. I didn't quite hear that. But after practice day 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then you realize that Dixon is out of the ballpark and Bourdais can't even stay up, I was just surprised that there was such a big difference between the operational modes of Chevrolet and Honda. That was probably the biggest surprise for me over the month. It really was. And then, of course, the growing question is, should we have bumping on qualifying day? Was that human drama story worth the fact that one of the biggest names in the sport missed the race? Do we need to change the rules and protect, the guys who invest for the full season? That's a difficult question to answer, because that's like saying, well, why don't we just open up the grid to whoever wants to come here? You begin to open up a bit of a can of worms when you begin to change rules that were part of what created a history of the great event. Which was qualifying, which was bump day, which was bubble day. You know what I mean?
Yeah. haven't changed my opinion whatsoever. I wrote about it long before we got to the month of May, and was very pleased when I asked Jay Fry however many months ago, or time's a little bit of a mystery to me right now, but looks like we're going to have 35 cars. Been some rumors that you might let them in, yes or no. The answer is absolutely not. It's 33 cars, field of 33. That's what we're sticking with. That's what we're going forward with. I know some exceptions have been made in the past, but that is meant to be our consistent history. And I'll admit I was disappointed with some of the opinions that came out afterwards. Roger Penske, for example, believing that, full-time entries should be locked in and such. And I get where he's coming from. Everyone is so risk-averse because it's really, it's been a while since quality teams had a reason to fear. I realize this isn't an apples-to-apples comparison, but I think of the Indy 500 as not being too dissimilar from the playoffs for any of the major sporting leagues. And, there's a lot more at stake in those because there's so much money involved there, just far more dollars involved. But there is an aspect to me where, at least in my mind, I find a parallel where you go, okay, well, in the NBA, it's, the top 8 from each conference, so on and so forth, and we whittle this down to who gets in. NFL, every major series has its structure on how they go from the roughly 30-ish teams they have to whittle them down into the finals. We don't necessarily have a finals, but we do have a field of 33. So for me, if we are going to be looking at a growth next year and the year after, which I think we will, Derek, I think 35 cars, provided Chevy and Honda want to make the engines available, I think we could be seeing more entries trying to get in. And at that point, you do have to wonder, all right, what should I do as a sponsor? Should I put money behind a driver who doesn't have a great history of going quickly here? Or do I take a smaller role in a more successful team? These are just some questions that were asked and had to be considered in the past, during your era as well. We haven't had to ponder for a while.
Yeah, and I did hear Roger's comment about, times are now different, times have changed. Maybe we need to think about protecting. However, I also heard him say in his victory banquet speech, failing in 1995 to get Emerson Fittipaldi and Alonso Jr., two of the biggest names in our sport, when they failed to get those two drivers in the race, Roger said, we became a better team because of it. And I became a better person because of it. And so if we can grow the quality of these teams because of the rules we have in place that are black and white, the sport ultimately benefits. Now remember, Schmidt-Peterson made some critical errors. That's what caused them not to get into the Indy 500.
Yep.
The Allen screw was left loose on the pressure sensor in the rim. But even more critical is, I don't believe they realized the gun was going to go off at 5:50. They thought they had another 10 minutes, I think.
Well, Hinch clarified. Hinch did clarify that, and again, some of these things as they're presented on the day, that's what you go with. That's what you write about, discuss, and information often trickles out. Additional info trickles out in the days afterwards. Not everybody's going to write a follow-up column saying, "Okay, here's a 20-word story to clarify something from 2 days ago." But Hinch did eventually clarify that he was the one who was confused about when qualifying ended, and he said the team was not confused, and the team did know it ended at 5:50. Okay. He was off.
That's fair. Yeah. But it was a critical team error that caused the issue with the vibration.
And a lack of speed before that.
And the lack of speed before that,
And so here's a little bit of, on the topic of trying to bring in some things that either weren't available at the time, either bits of info or some other aspects that have maybe been clarified a little bit further. None of this on the record, I'll admit, so I apologize if you wanted me to tell you that person A said these exact things on the record, but We had one thing that stands out to me coming out of the month of May here, which, there's a little bit of a stain, I think, Derek, on how the Lena Gade situation was handled, how that came to a conclusion with Schmidt-Peterson Motorsports and her role as James Hinchcliffe's incredibly high-profile race engineer. So let's delve into that and maybe one or two items quickly before we move on to Q&A, because I know we need to get you out of here in about 50-ish minutes or so. Here's a couple things, and I'm just going to throw them out. They don't necessarily all add up to a perfect conclusion, but these are some of the things that I've had shared with me that I would say I'm very confident in. If we wind back from Lena's firing, and it was a firing, this relationship was somewhat rocky very early on in the season. And I don't mean rocky as in, relationship drama, he said, she said, and I don't mean that type of stuff. I'm talking strictly from a working professional standpoint. Have heard from multiple people who would know that there were just some things that weren't quite what they were expected to be. I don't want to say they weren't as advertised, because I don't think Lena was advertising anything, but I think there was a belief that, hey, this is an elite international race engineer, and yes, learning the ovals will be the challenge, but Lena's, half the folks on timing stands in IndyCar have a British accent, Australian accent, some kind of accent. So there are lots of folks who come to IndyCar as an engineer from another discipline, have to learn ovals, and many of those folks have Indy 500 winning rings and otherwise. So the concept of Lena coming over, learning ovals, and becoming highly adept at them, not a strange thing, not out of her expected capabilities. What I'm told was found was, is it possible that the person who had 20 plus engineers in a support role in the Audi Sport program, for example, is a person who's had so much support for a number of years, maybe now somewhat prone or exposed in a team where you have an assistant engineer. Some teams have things structured where the race engineer has both an assistant engineer and a data engineer. In many cases, the assistant engineer is the data engineer, or vice versa, but it's often a two-person pairing. In some situations, there's three, but it's often a two-person pairing. Was this something where, without the big infrastructure, that maybe this was a larger thing to tackle and to master than maybe was expected? So that would be environment, right, Derek? Hey, if I'm working in a big group and I have tons of support and I'm winning and kicking butt, fantastic. What happens when you remove that support system? Are you still able to thrive based on all of your skills? Or do you find out that maybe there are a lot of folks providing areas of support that once they're taken away, maybe those were revealed as shortcomings? So again, I'm not saying that's a fact, just saying this is something I've heard from a couple places, like, outside of the Audi environment, maybe the fully developed top tier race car engineer was a couple years away from reaching that point, and that's not who showed up. So again, just sharing.
Yeah. So just in case people don't understand, Lena Gade was the high-profile female engineer who came from the Audi World Championship sports car success story, and she was hired to move away from Audi and come to engineer Hinchcliffe. So it came as high profile. I met her at the PRI show in Indianapolis in December, and I was curious, Marshall, just like you were, how good will she be? Now, it didn't last long. She got fired in May. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. I have discussed this with people who know what happened, but there's a couple of interesting things. Because she's female, I think a lot of people wanted her to succeed. Fuel the Female has suddenly jumped up as a movement in the sport for the good of the sport, I believe.
Absolutely.
So when Lena gets fired, you say, whoa, why did she get fired? Because she's female? No. Because she couldn't do the job? Possibly. Well, how could that happen? I think with a driver like Hinchcliffe, you cannot go the rest of the season with any doubt in your mind if there's an engineering lack or a gap somewhere that's not giving him what he needs. And he should demand whatever engineer he needs. And if the team determines they need to make a change, they need to make it fast. Because from here on in, if Lena was not able to do the job, it would become an embarrassment for her to stay there anyway, as rough as it was for her to leave. Now, you mentioned something earlier about, was she in a support role at Audi? Did that protect her? Was her stature elevated and the perception elevated because she was surrounded by so many people? There are people who can create the structure. Leadership styles, leadership abilities that then create the structure and flourish. And there are people who cannot create the structure but can flourish within the structure. If she is that person, she may end up finding her feet somewhere else in a support role in a structure that's already created. But, so if it did stink, as you mentioned, yes, it might have. A lot of things stink when you're in a high-pressure situation. And I thought it was ironic that the engineer they got rid of was Alan McDonald, who moved over to Ed Carpenter.
Who had the fastest car of the month.
Who had the fastest racing car of the month. So, let me pose another question. Is the decision maker the one that has the stink?
Well, let me throw a few other items in here.
That's a fictitious question.
No, understood.
We're having a bit of fun.
No. Let me throw just a few other things in here. And again, I'm not tying everything up into a nice bow. I'm just sharing, a lot of folks share a lot of things. Some of them I know to ignore, and others I know, okay, you know exactly what you're talking about. We look at the fact that Hinch was 5th coming into the Indy 500 in points, nothing but top 10 finishes. And I know a lot of folks said, well, how could you get rid of an engineer who did that, right? Not discrediting Lena in any way, shape, or form. I would just say that keep in mind the team also revamped their engineering department to put Todd Malloy in charge, and he definitely helped elevate things across the board. Look at Robert Wiccans, for example. His race engineer, Blair Perschbacher, a good engineer, someone who's worked with many good teams, but has never really stood out as a watch out. Blair is looking like a rock star this year with what he and Wiki are achieving. So just saying, as a whole, SPM's engineering program has been on a rise. I would say that assigning Wiccans' impressiveness solely to Blair would be silly. Assigning Hinch's speed up to and prior to the 500 to Lena would be silly. I would say that as a engineering group, they have been doing incredibly well, and barring a couple things we've spoken about before, Wiccans could already have a couple of wins this year. So just, as a whole, they've been doing well, but it would be silly to say either race engineer has been wholly responsible for their drivers' performances. Let's get into a couple other quick things, and then we're going to move off. You'll also note, I mentioned that it seemed like the dynamic was off, and what they were hoping for and expecting might not have been there, at least, team impression-wise. Lena did some press earlier in the year. I mean, I interviewed her, and I know some other folks have interviewed her. But if folks look back over the past month or two and look for what you would expect, a fairly common thread in the media, Derek, of talking about this high-profile, famous female race engineer, that you really aren't going to find them. So I wonder why. Is there a reason that either she wasn't speaking or wasn't made available? Just some things to consider. Let's throw in one or two more things that might, to me at least, be the most important takeaways. I don't have a timeline on this, but I do know that after things did not go, I've been told, I should say, but I do know that, from what I've been told, after things did not go particularly well at all on the Phoenix Oval, there was a decision to involve technical director Todd Malloy more and more, and I don't know when, and I don't know to exactly what degree, but I do know that he was brought in more and more during the week of practice and qualifying to lend his engineering talents to the number 5 car. So, this is just starting to speak to something where if you're trying to understand where things were going, why things might have led to where they ultimately did, if you have a engineer who's been hired to be the primary race engineer and you're having to lean on and start moving in the technical director to do more of the race engineering on the ovals, you could take things one of two ways. You could either say, well, we didn't expect you to be brilliant, but we didn't expect to have to bring in someone else to shoulder some of the burden here. And the flip side is, well, you knew you're bringing in someone brand new. Shouldn't that have been a big part of the plan all along, where essentially you're grooming this person to be an excellent oval engineer? Where was the team support sufficient to make that happen? So what this comes up, for me at least, Derek, is it's clear that there was something that wasn't working. Predating Indy, I would say well before we got into the month of May. From more and more what I've been told, the team had to start looking in other directions to engineer the car on the oval during the month of May, which almost makes a person somewhat redundant if that's what they've been hired to do. But you are left having to ask, well, if this is a team and the overall engineering has risen as a whole, where was the support plan to get the most out of Lena? Was it there? I don't know. They aren't. I've asked, the team doesn't want to respond. The final thing I'll throw out, which we saw a lot of people talking about, scapegoat, right? Failed to qualify. Lena's the scapegoat. If Todd Malloy was taking a bigger and bigger percentage of the engineering for Hinch's car, and that car failed to make the show, part of me wonders, well, why would the timing of Lena's dismissal just strikes me as something that is hard to reconcile on this timeline? Could that have been done this week? Should it have been done? Just, I'm just saying, this doesn't all line up to me, at least.
Let me finish the conversation here. Todd Malloy did not need an scapegoat, I believe. And if Lena Gade is as good as some people think she is, she'll be okay. She'll still make it in the sport.
Fair enough. All right, let's get into some Q&A here. Actually, let me do one other thing. I'm going to throw in something else that I heard during the month that it'll be interesting to see if this heads in a direction or not. We try and leave at least one little nugget in each episode. I've heard, and I've also spoken with someone on the team who confirmed it to some degree, that our friends at Harding Racing will be looking to start tightening their belts a bit. I know that Mike Harding was hoping to see a number of sponsors come on board to help offset the costs that he's taken care of out of his own pocket during the team's first full season. And since that hasn't happened yet, I do know that strategy-wise, they're maybe looking to some other sponsorship acquisition strategy changes. But I've also heard, and again do have at least from one person, that they are going to start looking to tighten their belts a bit financially until they can get some sponsors to come in and offset those costs. While I completely understand that and would be doing the same thing if I was in Mike Harding's position, always scares me when you hear about a season not even halfway through its first full year, full schedule, Derek, and they're looking to save every penny possible.
Well, let me tell you, how many times have you seen a private individual who gets involved in a sport, and he's largely driven by passion and emotion? Mike is from Indianapolis. He grew up around the racetrack. They have their birthday party, company party at the racetrack every year.
Love the guy.
You know, he loves the sport. Yeah, but eventually, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you get tired of spending 3 or 4 or 5 million of your own personal money. Until somebody else has to pay the bills, you say, whoa. So I think they're going through a perfectly normal scenario. Now, they got some great people over there. With Barnhart, with Kevin, with Unser Jr. I just hope that they've built as impressive a commercial department, because it is a full-time job from a well-organized, creative commercial department within a team to go out on the street and to solicit commercial support for a sport that, quite frankly, doesn't have the eyeballs to warrant large investments. That's the major commercial issue. So you got to be super creative commercially, business to business, business to consumer, and you know, unless they put that piece of the puzzle in place, I understand exactly why Mike Harvey might be saying, "Whoa, hang on, you want my checkbook again? Wait."
As someone who has solicited himself on the streets, we will take your advisement here very seriously.
Yeah, and remember, this is a team that started off like gangbusters.
Oh, yeah.
Chavez ran really super races last year, but now the reality of just how hard it is beginning to be realized here.
So one thing we do, Derek, when we jump into our Q&A, I go and pick my favorite question from the previous week, thanks to our friends at TorontoMotorsports.com, and I thoroughly encourage folks to dial up TorontoMotorsports.com and check out the cool memorabilia and swag and stickers and T-shirts and all kinds of cool racing stuff that they have. We pick my favorite question from the previous week and ask that person to send in their preference for what they want for Marshall Pruett podcast swag and whatnot. And this is going to go to Gabe Argenta. Ricardo Juncos was my guest last week, and I hope folks fell in love with him if you didn't know him already. One of the great stories in motor racing. And Gabe kicked things off with a question that really just helped show folks who Ricardo was, asking him if he had any stories from Ricardo running his own Spec Miata at the SCCA National Runoffs last year at Indy. So Gabe loved that question, and Ricardo did as well. He genuinely lit up when we read that question off. So Gabe, hit me with a direct message. Tell me whether you want an MP podcast T-shirt or mug, and what size if it's a T-shirt, and your email address and mailing address. So hit me with a direct message, and we will get you sorted, all courtesy of TorontoMotorsports.com. All right, Mr. Daly, we're going to go here. Start off with Kevin Frederico. We already covered the first question. He said, Marshall, do you ever think Will Power would master Indy? And the answer is yes. I picked him multiple times years ago and was wrong that he would win. But as I joked with him Monday morning, I did pick you. It was just about 5 years ago. But Will is one of the best we have. Not one of the most consistent, as we've discussed, but one of the best. So always thought that once he broke through that oval barrier, that mental oval barrier that he had, and started winning races on ovals, definitely stood out to me that, the 500 could be a thing for him for sure. Corey Matthews asks, and this of you, were there any fears that Connor's ride would be bought out once Hinch failed to qualify? I don't know how much you want to crack that open or not, but was that how real of a concern was that for you, at least?
The main backer was the U.S. Air Force, and I'm sorry, U.S. Air Force is driven by national pride. There was no way a Canadian was going to get into the U.S. Air Force car. So just on that practical issue alone, that was a hurdle that could not have been overcome. And with the amount of work that Connor had to do to put this whole deal together, to drag in Lilly Diabetes and people like that, there was no way, unless it was a life-altering offer, was he ever going to consider stepping out of the car for somebody else. And that life-altering offer never came, and it would have had to have been life-altering.
We have another question here that I thank you for asking this one, Jerry Sudduth. He's inquiring about temperature and heat during the race, and he said he routinely noticed that the announcers during the pre-race festivities were talking about track temperatures and noticed the wide swing and how warm the track was in different corners, and he asks what teams can do to set up cars with such temperature variations in mind. And I mean, simulation is a big tool that teams will use, Jerry. There's also the Aero book that they'll use as well, where they can look at their tuning options for the race, for example. We've already covered a bit of this, but we know we can only go to maximum 2 degrees positive on the rear wing. We can, therefore can only probably go in this range on the front wing, and can also plug in temperature as well into these predictive models and say, okay, it's looking like it's going to be extremely hot. What's the number we're expecting to see track temp-wise, ambient temperature-wise? And they will get very accurate information on what kind of downforce they will have, what kind of variation, because of the higher ambient, the thinner air. So to your question on how they can modify their setups, well, with that information in mind, that's where they start doing the tuning. So tire pressures as well.
But let me add to that. They guess. They guess at it as best they can. They don't know. They have reams of data. But we saw on Sunday the huge difference of some performance levels of some of the cars. Shows that particularly last Sunday they guessed as best they could. Even in Formula One, and they spend a fortune gathering big data and crunching the numbers. Even in Formula One today, with the $450 million budgets for Ferrari and Mercedes, they still can't predict perfectly. They have to guess as best you can, and that's why seat of the pants and what I call a racetrack engineer as opposed to a laptop engineer can become invaluable when the conditions change and you just read it and you make decisions as you go. But a lot of it is guesswork. They are far from perfect, which is good, by the way, because if we had them perfect, then we'd have slot car racing.
The other thing, too, to add to that, and I don't entirely disagree, but what you're going to have ultimately, Jerry, are teams and the race engineers coming up with what they believe is the right answer. There's no guesswork in that. What they come up with,
best guess.
What they come up with is what they believe will work. But what ends up happening, exactly to Derek's point, is you're going to start off the race with what you think is the answer. And then you get a few laps in, and you find out it's the old, the axiom varies, but it's the coming up with a strategy for a fight, and once you get punched in the face for the first time, that strategy goes out the window. It's somewhat similar here. You go in thinking this is the right path, again, whether it's tire pressures, aero, blah blah blah, and you're quickly told by the track and your driver, nope, or yes, or kind of, and you start tuning and narrowing towards, at least at that point, what will make the car a little bit better. But yeah, to your point, rarely, you might have 1 or 2 or 3 drivers out of a field of 33 who start the race and go, awesome, I got it, this is great. More often than not, it's folks going, help.
Yeah, and engineers know that they're not looking for perfection, but they're looking for the best compromise.
Something that you can work with. If you're so far out the window that you're having to make radical changes, I might have mentioned this, it feels like it was over a year ago maybe, but I think it was the 2000 IRL race at Phoenix. The team I was working with, which was small and garbage, I was part of the reason it was garbage, so I'm not blaming other folks here. We didn't really have a race engineer for our car. We had me as an assistant engineer, and for whatever reason, they let the crew chief make setup calls, which he'd never done before. And, again, when you're hired to do a job, you don't say, no, person who runs the crew, I'm going to, you could, but then you'd be fired. So it was interesting to see that in a case of, let's start the race, and the driver calls back very quickly and says, I'm coming in now, it's trying to kill me. And normally, again, you'll try and make some changes that involve a twist of something with your hand, or you put a wrench on something very quickly and crank something one way or the other. We were making camber changes, changing camber shims on pit lane during the race, didn't fix anything, then wheeled the car behind pit wall, Derek, to put the to get the car ready to throw it onto the setup pad, and made toe changes in the middle of a race to try and make it not complete garbage. And so I'm just mentioning this from personal experience, where when you're having to make camber and toe changes in the middle of a race because the car is so undrivable, that's when not only you're not even a guess would be a convenience at that point. So that's the far extreme of bad.
Sounds like Davison's car halfway through the race.
Oh, Lord. Let's go to Brian Smith's question. He said, would a more conventional rear wing design have alleviated some of the issues we saw on Sunday? Well, Brian, the rear wing actually is not an unconventional design. If we go back to the manufacturer super speedway rear wings, call it just the Indy 500 rear wing, learned something very interesting I was unaware of, and I felt stupid to realize that I had missed this all along. But in a conversation with one of the folks from IndyCar, I found out that Chevrolet's rear Indy 500 wing the past 2 years was not actually a wing profile. It was a symmetrical profile, which is another way of saying it wasn't responsible really for making much downforce. Honda's, which was tiny as well, which it was an actual wing profile, but itself, it didn't make a ton of downforce. We did have the little winglets on the side of the rear wheel pods that helped make downforce, and there were other things contributing, but I don't think bigger rear wing was so much necessary, Brian. The ability to add more angle to it definitely would have helped. The ability, if teams wanted to be able to add a gurney flap to it, that certainly would have helped. If teams could have added gurney flaps to the top of the diffuser, I think that would have helped. There's some things that can be done that aren't extreme that I think would have just pick the number that would have helped. 50 pounds of downforce, 75. I don't know what teams needed for those that were struggling, but for those who were painted into a corner and had all they had, we did see that it was insufficient in some cases. But I don't think a rear wing design is really the thing that we need to do to fix that. Let's see. Let's move on here. Oh, here we go. Evan Kempe says, I'll ask the obvious. Aside from the one road course NASCAR race, what's next for Connor Daly? Dancing with the Stars?
From the Xfinity?
Yes.
I don't know what else is next. I just know that's the next one he has. I don't know what else. Connor lives downtown, so I don't see him that often. He's busy.
Go see your parents.
Busy and
go see your father. What? Go see your father, Connor. Come on now. Good Lord.
He's too busy. He's
right. The guy's done one race this year and he's too busy. I'm not going to buy that for a minute. All right. Let's see. Well, Michael Wallace is picking up on something that we spoke about a little bit. He says, I watched Danica's post-wreck press conference. I'm just wondering what the two of you thought. I know you said you hadn't seen it, so this will be from me. People say she had a bad attitude, no class, salty, and whatever else. I wouldn't expect anything less from a driver who wrecked out of the Indy 500 in their last race, or am I too nice? Michael, again, she was a little bit salty. There was someone trying to ask a question, and I don't remember exactly how she phrased it, but she more or less said, just stop. I'll just go. I'll just start talking here. Please stop. Look, I'll share this, and it's not a criticism, it's maybe just an observation. I won't pretend to know Danica Patrick very well. The last time I knew her at all or had any she would at least see me and recognize who I was back in 2011, her last full season in IndyCar. The main observation I had, Derek, seeing her for the first time, interviewing her for the first time a month ago during the open test was, wow, these 6-7 years in NASCAR have outputted a completely different person. You might go, well, duh, idiot. She's just spent, all these years in the spotlight in NASCAR, a much bigger spotlight than IndyCar. At the same time, she was either the biggest deal or one of the biggest deals in IndyCar, had nothing but attention constantly. I know that ramped up in NASCAR, but it was really interesting just to see how shut down and locked down that she was. And answers, were very much either yes, no, or just a couple of words, or very contentious.
Yeah.
Ask a question and it's immediately kind of, I don't want to say attacking, but, jabbing back at the person if it wasn't phrased completely perfectly. What do you mean? Or, what is that you're saying? Or do you mean this? And it's just this thing of, okay, are we getting into is this a verbal jousting? I love verbal jousting, but if that's what we're doing, then let's do it. But that's just not what we expect here in IndyCar. So it was just interesting to see the kind of life, human, personal changes she's gone through, having been, in that huge NASCAR spotlight, coming back down, to be with peons like me. And, there was no real wiggle room or warmth, but I don't know if that should be a total surprise. So, Michael, I wasn't, I didn't look at her like, oh, she's totally different and, snooty and whatever else. It was, man, this, now I maybe know why she's retiring, because it doesn't seem like she's having a lot of fun. And if I just said farewell to my career by crashing out, I probably would have been quadruple an SOB in that press conference if it was me. So I can't really think of anything to say that was really negative about her reaction, because I would have been way worse.
Can I just add one thing to that? And I did not see her press conference. It is my opinion she was driven out of NASCAR by the criticism. Shame on you, NASCAR. You will miss that star. Just like IndyCar missed her greatly when she left to go to NASCAR. End of story. Move on.
Taking direction on my own podcast. That's a first. Son of a bee. Let's see. Adam Smith asked a question about fuel strategy for Steph and Jack Harvey. We already got into that a little bit, and he thanks Bell Helmets for their support this month. I second that, Adam. Peter Crimes, and I hope I'm not murdering your last name. Folks have dubbed me the last name assassin, which is very fitting. He says, hey Marsh, what do we think about in-car controls as they relate to the snap oversteer problems some drivers had at Indy? Some said they had a push before. I wonder if the weight jacker, overuse of a combo of the weight jacker and sway bars might have been the culprit. Everyone is quick to blame the new aero package, but could it just be the overuse of in-car tuning tools? How's this? If a driver had made a massive change to those tools, meaning they were in the pits, you will often reset your tools, if not completely, to some degree, whether, throughout a fuel or throughout a run, your fuel will burn off, you'll make some changes to the anti-roll bars, etc., possibly the weight jacker to tune the changing balance of the car. You'll often bring those back to zero or close to zero. If a driver came in, fresh tires, full fuel, went back out, and then just went BAM on one of those tools and drastically altered the handling of the car, I could see where that might be a consideration. I don't think that was the case, though. I think that the aero sensitivity was just something that caught out a lot of our best drivers and most experienced drivers, and that's just what it was. Let's see. Oh, here we go. I like this one from Norm Nelson, Derek. I guess after the race, Ed Carpenter expressed his extreme fondness for Will Power and also mentioned that he would like to have him race for Ed Carpenter at some point in time. And Ed said, I don't know if we have a tampering rule in IndyCar, but congrats to Will. And Norm's question of wondering what Ed was referring to in the tampering part, and I don't believe IndyCar has any kind of tampering rule like the NFL or NBA where they say, hey, team owners cannot just openly in the media say, hey, I'm going to go after so-and-so to be on my team, or I want to try and pry this guy away from another team. But do you see anything wrong in that, in an active team owner / driver like Ed Carpenter saying, hey, I'd love to have Will as my teammate someday while he's still under contract?
No, mainly because it'll never happen. There's no way Will Power is going to leave Roger Penske's team for Ed Carpenter's team. I don't care how quick Ed Carpenter was on his pole position run. Will be at Penske until he retires from racing. Yes, and I've never heard anything about tampering or anything like that in our sport. No.
This question from Curtis Cleveland, I'm just telling you right now, Curtis, this is an early candidate for my favorite question of the week. He says, for Derek, given where Zach Veach's sponsorship originated, has Connor started going to church? And if you don't know the story, Zach picked up his multi-year deal with the Group 1001 through a connection made by his pastor.
Wow. Okay. I'm up for anything.
I thought you did this for a living. I thought you were an IndyCar analyst. This is basic stuff, Daly. I shouldn't be breaking news to you here.
But Connor has been a churchgoer all of his life, and it has yet to produce a $5 million sponsorship package. So he mustn't be going to the right one. And there's lots of them in America. Good for Beach. Yeah, I had heard that story. Good for him, and long may it last.
All right, here's one that I will leave to you, my man. Mike Jablo says, I was listening to the teams on my scanner during qualifying, and he says, what do terms like Wheel 8, Slot 2, Map 3, and such by the engineer to the driver mean? So curious about some of the steering wheel instructions that are passed on from a team to a driver. And well, I don't expect you to know, every team has their own numbers or codes to call, but what are some of the things that engineer would tell a driver to tune on the steering wheel?
So every time the driver drives out of the pit lane, the Honda engineer tells the race engineer what wheel to have in it, and which I believe is the map. What map to be on? I think it's 1-6 or 1-8.
Yep.
And then on the first warm up lap, they'll have it at a certain map, and then once it gets up to full speed, they go to another map. And this is laid out to the driver. As he runs, obviously, but they are forever changing it. When they get into heavy traffic, they'll tell the driver, go to a different map, because in heavy traffic, you can just run in the draft, don't have to run as hard, you use less fuel, because they are forever trying to save fuel. But that's the main instructions. 90% of the instructions is to what fuel map, what wheel to run in the car at a particular time.
Got about 15 minutes left here with our man Derek Daly, so we're going to try and pare down some sharp questions to close the week in IndyCar, our Indy 500 review episode. Henri Fawn, or Henry Fawn, or however this should be pronounced correctly. So there's a couple questions about our new Indy 500 champion, Willie P. One, how much of the $2.52 million can he keep for himself? And how much goes to the team and his crew? No exact numbers, but in broad terms. And 2, why doesn't milk fit in his diet? Is he lactose intolerant? Some health reasons or just too much fat. And then for me, he says, I've often said that Will is crazy, mad, insane, or some to that extent. Did we see his crazy eye Sunday, or is he usually mad in another less psycho-looking way? I'll take the last 2, Derek, and then save the one about prize money for you. I don't know about the milk part. It seemed like that's just something he had cut out, so I will ask the lad next time I see him. About being crazy, mad, insane, Robin and I were hoping to do a video. We didn't get a chance at Indy, but talking to drivers about the driver they would want to fight the least, and we're all convinced it's Power, because this is a guy who's readily admitted growing up in the streets of Toowoomba, Australia, a little bit of a rough and tumble place. He'd be walking down the street just as a teenager, young kid, whatever, and would just, someone would just throw a huge punch, and he'd wake up however many minutes, just get knocked out. And that wasn't totally abnormal. Getting into fights, getting into scraps, a little bit of a punk lifestyle. And that's Will, right? He's not some perfectly groomed little prima donna. This is a guy who just about as hearty of a person as you could imagine, but if you look at him, you wouldn't think it. Even if you listen to him during, a normal interview, you wouldn't know it. But the willpower not on the TV cameras is one of my favorite people. I've said that forever since I got to know him. He and I, I'm not saying we're best friends or even close to that, but, he and I always have time for each other. We've had countless conversations, just, phone calls, whatever, where it's just talking about life, the universe, and everything. And he's just a crazy, fun guy. Like, if he was your next-door neighbor, if he was, in your dorm in college or you went to school with him, he'd be one of your best friends because he's just a nut, loves to have fun, has wild views about the world. He does believe in aliens. He's one of those guys you're like, he's going to be the life of the party. Just turns out that he's also one of the world's best race car drivers, too. So the mad, crazy, insane side, that's all said with reverie and warmth, not that he has any mental defects there. And let's get to the first question, Derek. On average, and I don't think you have his contract in front of you, but in general, what might a driver keep from a big winning like this, and what might get passed on otherwise?
Right, interesting question, Henry, and we actually don't know the answer, but general rule of thumb, 60-40, 60% of the team, 40% of the driver. Now, when the driver is guaranteed a retainer, which all Penske drivers are, sometimes that percentage of prize money can be lower. But I believe on average 60-40, so even if it was a bit lower, it's still a nice payday for Will Power, which might have explained some of his emotional outbursts, which were awesome to see on the victory podium and in the car. Loved it. As Connor said on the victory banquet, he looked like a psychopath, which is great.
Well, at least we're seeing an honest representation. Christopher Logan says, I'd like to hear the story of Willie T. Ribbs introducing you to Muhammad Ali.
Oh, yeah, that was one of the great moments in my life. It was after the Long Beach Grand Prix in '84. Myself, Willie T. and John Del Penna are cruising around Beverly Hills, and Willie T. blurts out, hey, let's go see Muhammad Ali. I'm thinking, yeah, of course. He says, yeah, I know him. So we drive off to this neighborhood, come to this gated community. Willie T. was in the back seat of the car, leans out the window and says, hey, Willie T. to see Muhammad Ali. I'm thinking, we're going to jail. In we go. The guy starts to give us directions. Willie T. says, I know where he lives. We pull up outside the house. The butler walks out. And I'm thinking, wow, this could be real. We walk up, introduce ourselves to the butler. I lead the group down the hallway. All the lights were off. All the blinds were pulled. I get down to the end of the hall. He tells me turn left. I turn left. And there, behind his desk in his home office, is Muhammad Ali.
Wow.
Man, my heart began to skip a beat because, I mean, he is my sporting hero. You know, we grew up in an era when Muhammad Ali was the greatest athlete in the world. I mean, he was the man. And there he was. And I walked in, Willie T was behind me, Della Penna, and there was 2 or 3 other people in the room. Muhammad Ali never recognized, never acknowledged that we even came into the room. He was head down, and he was writing something. And he continued to write, and then he looks up, sees us all, and says, "Hey, what do you think of this?" Never says, "Hey, hello, how are you, who are you, what are you?" He just started to read some of the speech. He said, "I have to give a speech tomorrow, and these are my opening lines. What do you think?" And of course, we're saying, "Oh, whatever you want." Great. What do you say to Muhammad Ali when he asks a question? But here's the wildest thing that happened. He looks at me. I was one of 2 white guys in the room. He looks at me. "Where are you from?" And, you know, so I stumbled as best I could to say, you know, race car driver from Ireland. No Willie T for a lot of years. And then he said to me, he says, "Do you know why I learned magic?" I said, "No, I didn't know you did magic." He comes around the desk, and suddenly flowers appear out of his pocket, and balls disappear, and coins disappear. And I'm thinking, man. He says, "Do you know why I learned magic?" He says, "Because I wanted to be able to convince people how easily they could be deceived." I thought, whoa, okay, this is the man. And here's the real kicker. He hands me the Quran. He has me read to the rest of the people in his office excerpts from the Quran. Can you believe that?
Hi.
Do you believe that in 1984, I'm in Muhammad Ali's house. He's having me read the Quran to the other guests in his house. I was absolutely shaking with adrenaline pounding through my veins that Muhammad Ali had even conversed with me, let alone in his own house. It was an unbelievable time in my life, and still is today. I have great photographs of it with me and him in his office, all set up by the great Willie T. Ritt. It was just an awesome time.
And now we finally know when you converted to Islam. That is so awesome.
There you go. Yeah, I was completely convinced that he was correct. He was trying to convince me and show up everybody else how all religions other than Islam, how people can be duped into believing what is fake is actually correct. Hence, learning magic. How easily we can be deceived. It was a pretty convincing story back in 1984.
Absolutely.
That was a great question, Henry. Thanks.
Greatest of all time. One of my heroes, and I think most people's heroes.
Yeah.
All right, let's close on 2 questions here. One from a Don, one from a Dan. We'll start off with Don. He says, in practice, drivers complained about understeer when approaching another car. But in the race, the crashes seemed to be attributed to oversteer. Why not bring back the Kardashians, the rear wheel guards, and strike a balance not only in the driving characteristics, but in the ability to make a pass? So this is Don referring to these rear wheel guards did help clean up drag coming off the back of the cars, which would in theory reduce turbulence, which would in theory hopefully clean up a little bit of understeer and maybe make passing more possible. What do you think, Derek? Should we make an Indy exception and bring the wheel guards back? Because it was a consideration IndyCar made, but chose against.
Yeah. I didn't have as big of an issue with the Kardashians as most people did. I thought it was a defining element of the car that distinguished an Indy car from every other open wheel car around the world. However, I understand why it's gone.
I mean, you could have stuck a giant dildo on top of the car and called that a distinguishing factor. So I'm just saying, you know.
Which, by the way, Keke Rosberg did do in his Chevron at Three Rivers in 1978.
Did he?
When he was sponsored by Excita
condoms. Yes.
Condoms. Yeah. So they will have to do something. There is something wrong with the wake created by the IndyCar. I don't know what the answer is, how to fix it, but they will be forced to do something. I don't know what it'll be yet.
All right, I'm going to throw in one quick question because I can answer it with a minute or two we have left with you. Colin Young, again, this is coming in on...
What about Don?
We did Don. We're saving Dan for last, but Colin, I realize that's a question I can answer quickly, and I'm trying to be smart with your time here. Colin says, Marshall, can you explain in what situations a car can get a lap back? I was watching scoring during the 500. Each caution, there were cars back on the lead lap, but it wasn't explained why. The way that tends to work, Colin, and each series can do things a little bit differently. NASCAR has their lucky dog and whatnot. If we have a situation where you are a lap down but ahead of the leader at that time, they'll often let you get your lap back, or if you are the car directly behind the leader, they will let you unlap yourself. So, we have situations here where it's become an accepted practice. And, every series will tend to do things a little bit differently. If you look through the rule books for an IMSA or NASCAR, etc., World Challenge, they all treat these things a little bit differently. But more or less, if you're the closest car to the leader, when a caution comes up, you'll often be given your lap back and given the ability to unlap yourself there. So it's more of a gift than an actual something you've done through competition and hard wheel-to-wheel racing. All right, let's close. Dan Glass, how pleased or disappointed are y'all about the proposed new engine regs? And these aren't proposed, these are actual, now cemented, other than the timing of their announcement on the disappointment side, because I did mention that this was unveiled by IndyCar a half hour before the start of qualifying. But give me your thoughts about this new quest for 1,000 horsepower by 2026 and starting off with approximately 900 in 2021. What are your thoughts on the new engine regs, Derek?
Should have happened 10 years ago. We should have had 1,000 horsepower 10 years ago.
That's my boy.
For years, IndyCar. I remember as a teenager in Europe, and it was called USAC, and you got these reports about these turbocharged 1,000 horsepower engines, and we saw them run at Silverstone, and these are beasts of cars. I just think we've had too much grip and too little horsepower for years and years, and I'd love to see some research group do a tabulation as to why the interest went down as the horsepower went down, and I bet there's a correlation. I want to see black tire strips ripping out of corners on road courses with drivers fighting for control of too much horsepower. And believe it or not, every driver wants to see it too. So I love 1,000 horsepower and lots of noise.
That is something those are descriptors that have been used for me after a night at Taco Bell, Mr. Daly. All right. I not only appreciate your gift of 2 hours of time here, Derek, but as I told you, I wanted you to join me here for this Indy 500 review because I knew that whether folks are going to agree or disagree with you, you're going to say absolutely what you believe, which I appreciate. And also want to say great thank you to Cooper Tires for their ongoing support for the year, and also to our friends at Bell Racing Helmets USA for coming on board for the month of May, and also to our awesome folks, awesome friends at TorontoMotorsports.com. So if you can, please check out all three and be good patrons. Mr. Daly, thank you, sir. We'll look forward to doing this here in a couple months again. And
anytime.
Off to Detroit for IndyCar. I'll be home this weekend, a little respite with my wife, but just booked my travel for Texas, so we'll be back on the road shortly. And thank you again for listening to the Marshall Pruett podcast and our week in IndyCar.